This time, I am delighted to welcome Jason Gulya. Jason is he's a professor. He's an AI coach. He's all sorts of things, but absolutely exploring AI at the moment. But before we get into that, Jason, quick introduction to yourself.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here, Guy, and actually get to see you and talk to you, which is such a different experience now, especially post-pandemic when we're all these virtual beings floating around the world. So super quick introduction. So I'm Jason Gulya. So I am a professor of English and writing at Berkeley College. So we're based in New Jersey and New York in the US. And so I teach essentially anything related to English, the humanities, and writing. So that in many ways has kind of flavored my approach to artificial intelligence and how it's forcing us to rethink writing in certain ways, because basically since ChatGPT came out at the end of November, I've been very much trying to figure out what we do with college and what we do with education now that we have AI out there that can create these things that are seemingly human, or we're getting closer and closer every day. So I'm trying to use social media and my classes to try to essentially figure out what to do with AI. And I'm very much in that question period when I'm just poking around and trying to figure out how to understand things, how to approach things with AI and microlearning and just education in general.
So let's start there. So where have you got to? Small question. Where have you got to in your thinking? I'm going to sit back now and just let you get on with it.
I'm at the point of trying to figure out what AI literacy is. I think that for a lot of us, when AI came out, there was this idea that we needed to figure out how to teach with it. And I think that's true. And then it became this realization that we needed to really start teaching AI literacy. And that was thrown out there as an idea. Everyone started to poke through it. And now, at least for me, as I've dug a little bit deeper, played with AI in the classroom, which I do most days, whether it's actually in the physical classroom or it's on my own and trying to figure out how to use it, I'm trying to come up with a better and more specific way of understanding what AI literacy actually is. Because I think that once you start using these AI programs of all these different kinds, it's really changing how we approach it. Because for many of us, especially early on after ChatGPT came out, we were thinking about it, and I was thinking about it as a text-based thing, right? And then we had to start to really rethink it as it started to create more and more images and videos and these whole worlds that you can create from seemingly nothing. And so that's kind of where I am. I'm trying to figure out, talking to my students, talking to other professors, and talking to learning and development professionals more broadly, what that actually means. And one of the reasons I come back to AI literacy is that I think going forward, it's going to be one of the big skills that's going to be asked of college students once they graduate, once they get those jobs, and trying to be able to figure out how to quote unquote read AI. And I think that right now, I think we should be more confused than certain about what AI literacy is. Because I think a lot of us, it's tempting to just announce what it is and define it in a couple of sentences and move on. But I don't think we can do that. We have to be willing to revise it. So that's kind of where I am on my journey. I'm very much stuck in a definition and trying to actually understand that concept.
I love the fact that you're very open about your AI confusion. All right, and I think that's a good place to be, because it's out of that we start to see perhaps what it's about and what it can do for us and how we can work with it. In terms of that idea of literacy, and when you talk about AI literacy, I'm sort of reminded back to the early days of social media, and people started talking about social media literacy. Are there specific things that are sort of evolving in front of you, as it were, in terms of what that literacy might look like?
I think there are a couple of things. One is trying to figure out what's actually happening on the back end. And as I coach more people and I work with students on this, I think this is one of the big questions, right? And really, I often start, especially with my students, just having them guess, right? So if they pop something into ChatGPT or Midjourney or whatever it is, and they get an output, just taking a second and guessing what they think is happening there, right? What they think happened in that quote unquote black box. So, that space that took us from the input, whatever it was, into the output. And then from there, depending on the conversations I have and what my students' ideas are, and if I'm working with a faculty member, their ideas are, then there are a couple of approaches. One is to kind of talk about their idea in more detail if it is kind of on the right track. Another method, which I would say is probably more common, is to kind of bring in ideas about how it's actually working, right? What it's doing. And this leads to conversations about whether AI is actually creating anything. Is it actually generating something, right? Or is it just scraping and combining stuff? And then if it is doing that, what's the difference, right? So these questions about what actually happens on the back end of AI, I think that's a huge part of AI literacy. I think another part, and this gets us, for me, straight, almost away from the college classroom and really into the workforce, how to combine them, right? So, and this is really, for me, where a lot of creativity happens, that I find it interesting if you look at social media and someone posts out, this is something I created with Midjourney. And that's kind of fun. You kind of look at that, you can learn a lot from it. But what's really exciting for me is when they combine it with something else. And that's where they're really showing their creativity and showing their literacy by being able to say, I created this in Midjourney. Then I figured out that if I did it in DID, I could do this. Then if I plugged it into this program, suddenly I have an image that's been made into an avatar that's suddenly walking around in a universe. And that's what's exciting for me, being able to figure out how to create these personal tech stacks that allow us to not just do things in the classroom, but do things in the workforce. Because I think being able to think about those combinations is one way that we can really be creative, be innovative, and doing that in the service of whatever we're trying to do, whether we're working for a company or for entrepreneurs, trying to figure out how to make that work. So for me, those are the two kind of sides of AI literacy I'm focusing on now, just because they've come naturally out of conversation.
Sure. And in terms of, thinking about, say, your role as a professor, how has AI impacted your thinking in terms of how you see that role, as far as you've got to, in a sense, with your thinking up to this point?
My conversations about AI in the classroom have been fascinating and surprising. I went into this semester, so we have a trimester system. So our current semester actually started at the end of April, and it's going into August. So I'm like halfway through. And I actually had the fortunate situation where, ChatGPT came out in November, and I was actually going into sabbatical in December. So I had like 3 months to play around with things. And that was a good thing because it allowed me to kind of track things a little bit more. But there was a problem I didn't foresee, and it was that I really lived in a bubble. All right. I was in this AI bubble. I played, I tinkered, I combined stuff. And then I went into a classroom. And I told my students that we were going to use AI. We were going to talk about it. And for some of them who weren't familiar with something like ChatGPT, I showed it to them. I was completely floored by the response. My students described ChatGPT as evil, soul-sucking, and as a force that was going to destroy us all, and that it needs to be eliminated or stopped immediately. And that is not like that was not a fringe belief in my classroom. That was the dominant belief. And it wasn't like I coached them there. It wasn't like I gave them anything. It was just, here's a thing. Let me know what you know about the thing. And so from there, and I don't think that is a totally unique experience. I think that many of us in the classroom talking about this stuff all the time, we might be surprised with the reactions we get. And sometimes they are fundamentally negative. And so that experience has caused me to really fundamentally rethink how I'm teaching this material, because it puts an educator really in a tough spot, right? Where on the one hand, we have that negative feeling, and I don't belittle those, right? Some of those feelings are legitimate, and I don't belittle my students' emotional responses to this technology. But on the other hand, we have ethical obligations to prepare our students for the world that they are going to live in. And if we're not working AI into our curriculum, we cannot do that. They're going to graduate and someone's going to say to them in an interview, all right, here's your role. Let me know how you would use ChatGPT to make it more efficient. And they're going to be totally unprepared to answer a question like that. And I think it's going to be not just a question that is asked in interviews. I think it might be a major question that might be make it or break it. It might be one of those questions where they say, if you don't have an answer to it, you're not moving it to the next level. And so that kind of ethical, practical quandary, I think is so interesting. I think it's going to change going forward as the technology gets more and more embedded into almost everything that we have. But that is something that has really forced me to lean into the coaching part of it. Because when I think of coaching, I think about someone who is able to really honor the person's ethical concerns and their emotions and everything like that, but is able to kind of very politely nudge them in a certain direction. And that's actually one of the ways in my mind I connect it to microlearning, because I think that's what microlearning does. It looks at where the learner is, and it kind of slightly nudges them by giving them practice, giving them content if they need it. So I've kind of leaned into that a little bit more than I might normally. I thought I was just going to go into the classroom and be met with positive feelings, and everyone's going to say, oh, this is so cool, let's do it. And I had to completely revisit that once I got very negative responses, and I had to like reframe my own mindset, my own approach.
Where did that come from? That concern or anxiety?
I think there were a couple of things at play. One was, so I would say that most of my students had heard of ChatGPT, but had never actually used it. Now, for that, I think a lot of it was, if they heard about it, it was in the context of job displacement. And they weren't getting information that was totally contextualized, because there's a lot of conversation about what's going to be displaced, what's going to be replaced, what sort of, are there economic sectors that are going to emerge out of this technology? What are those going to look like, right? They weren't getting that nuanced conversation. They were just going and looking and saying 30 million jobs over the next 5 years will be given over to AI, right? They just see like a number like that. And it's emotional, right? It is horrifying, right? Then you talk about the context, and you get away from that, I think, a little bit, at least a lot of us do. So I think that was part of it. They had heard about ChatGPT and AI in that context. And then there was another side of it. Some of my students had played with it before. And if they had, the experience was pretty uniform. They went into ChatGPT, they signed up for an account, and they did a chat or two. And they were annoyed by the output, and they moved on. They said that this is not useful, this is not good. They wrote it off, and they did something else. And so they had that initial response, which I get. If you don't know how to really use the system, it's not even just that your output might be bad, it's just that it's inefficient. You put so much work into getting something that's not very good, and that you have to scrap anyway. And so I think that those were the two big factors at play, that some of the students had heard about it, but in that context of basically job destroying jobs. And then others had played with it, been very, very underwhelmed by what they got, because no one really knew how to prompt it, especially if they played with it in December and then put it aside. So I think in the classroom, those were the invisible forces guiding the conversation, and I just was not prepared for them at that moment.
And in terms of where they are now, through your role as AI coach, are you managing to influence or get them to see different aspects or sides to the possibilities of AI in a more, I won't say better, but in a more sort of effective or relevant way for them?
Yeah, in a more nuanced way. That's kind of where I land, that I don't see myself as having the job of changing minds. Like, maybe that happens as kind of, a secondary or tertiary result of what I'm doing. But the big focus for me is guiding just nuanced conversations about it. And part of that is getting away from just having everything centered on ChatGPT, showing them other tools, showing them image creators, and having that sort of context. That if my students have that context and have actually played with some of the tools, and some of them don't actually want to use it. So I actually walk them through with my own accounts and we do it together. That way they're not giving any information, they're not doing anything like that, but they get some knowledge of it. And that has been very, very useful as a way to guide students along because, again, I want them to prepare for life after graduation. And that kind of guided use has allowed them to gain knowledge that I think they can use. I think the other thing that's really helpful for my students is once you get those different kinds of AI tools, right? Not just the text-based one, but the image ones and the video ones. I think they can see the applications a little bit more. That for many of us, when we approached ChatGPT and really thought about how useful it was, we talked about copywriting, we talked about writing blogs, right? That was our focus. And then it's interesting because when you go into a college classroom, that's not the focus. It might be the focus for a lot of people on LinkedIn because it's a writing and a text-based platform. But for a lot of our students, once you can show them, oh, this is an advertising video or campaign you can create that you could not have created a year ago, at least not as quickly. It might take you weeks or months to do. I think once that was brought into the conversation, they were a little bit more open to it. And so that was a way in which just giving more context, I think, started to change minds. Now, and I will say that several students, and I don't think this is a bad thing at all, know the context, know about the AI tools, and they're still opposed to them, right? And as long as they have that context, they have that information, like I'm willing to honor that. That is a legitimate position, right? If they think that. And for a lot of them, it becomes this conversation about regulation, what to do with these tools. And those are good ones, right? Those are good conversations that I think our students can really, really benefit from. But as I've coached them along, I think that they've become more and more nuanced with how they talk about it, even if I haven't like won them over, because I just think that's not really the point. And also it's just way too ambitious to me for me to do in, 3 months.
No, absolutely. But it's amazing to see all that you're doing. So what have you learned in your roles as a professor? Thinking about sort of moving forwards, I guess, what are you learning from AI that you'll go, I'm going to keep this within, my sort of my curriculum, I don't know if you call it a curriculum, but I'm going to keep this as part of what I do over the coming years. And I know it will evolve, and I know I can't necessarily ignore it or turn my back on it. It is part of what I now do. What does that bit of it look like in terms of you moving forwards?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions about what I should do. And when I finish this semester in August, I'm going to use my time to start figuring things out. My personal belief is that right now in mid to late June, educators should be tinkering and playing. We should be experimenting. We should be trying things out. Take that tool as long as we're comfortable, move it into the classroom, see what happens. I think that's where a lot of us need to be, myself included. I just needed to have that sort of space. But then in the fall, I think we need to change. I think we need to really think through our approach. We need to think about strategy. We need to think about where AI can be worked in and whether it can be worked in. And totally honestly and unabashedly, I take the ADDIE model. I use the ADDIE model from instructional design to make decisions about whether I should be using AI at all, right? So I look at whatever my students are working on, whatever the objective is, I do a needs analysis, right? I say, this is what my students need to know, or maybe they want to know, depending on the particular objective. So this is what they need to know. This is the skill they need to work on. Will AI help me out? Right? And so I have that question. And so if I think yes, all right, cool. Then I work into actually designing it and, putting things together. I implement it and then I evaluate at the end, right? And sometimes when I get to the evaluation part, I think, yes, I will keep that. Or yes, I will keep that, but I'm going to tweak it a little bit. Or no, I'm just going to get rid of it. And one of the big things that I learned and experimented with this semester was asking students to try to generate a rough draft of something with AI. And I found things online that said that really worked really well. And you can ask students to, evaluate the output, figure out if there are hallucinations, do a lot of sort of research. And I was really, really excited about that. Then, as I actually started to implement it, and then I evaluated it, I moved away from it. I will not be doing that in the fall, or I'm going to heavily revise it. And one of the reasons is that I realized that when you do that, when you hand over the rough draft to an AI, you basically hand over the brainstorming that happens through the act of writing, right? That a lot of my students, and I do this too, I need writing to figure things out. Right? I don't sit down thinking, all right, this is my idea. I sit down thinking, this is what I'm sort of thinking about. I go through and I do it, and then I take a step back and I look at it. And so I found that, especially early on in the semester, handing that over to an AI, even though I know that a lot of gurus on LinkedIn and everything else say, all right, we can do that. I think that actually backfired. And so that is a moment when I'm able to say, I got to the evaluating stage and I said, no, actually, I'm just going to abandon that completely. And then that's sort of like the extreme one. More often than not, I'm able to revise it and kind of work in it another way. Because for me, especially in a class that focuses on writing, I think we really need to diversify where AI is in the writing process. That sometimes we really benefit from having just as a part of the brainstorming part and not part of the writing at all, right? Other times we work it in later, and it totally just depends on the kind of writing we're doing. And I try to give my students the ability to decide where AI should be in their writing process, if at all. But I unabashedly take the ADDIE model as a way to figure out not just how to use AI, but whether I should be using it at all. Because in a classroom, and I think the same goes with training in the L&D space, when we're thinking about incorporating AI, it's a pro and con thing, right? I think if we hand over part of the learning experience to an AI, is almost automatically, just by the sheer act of handing it over, if the learner knows it, it's a negative act, at least as it is right now. It has a negative connotation. And then I think we need to balance that against what they get out of it, right? And if we think it is a net positive gain, yeah, then we do it. But more often than not, if it's doing the same thing that we'd be doing just with a human, but it's handed over to a machine, it might not be worth our time. It might be a net negative. And at least right now, for a lot of us, if you're a learner and you see something is completely AI generated and you know it, that's the negative experience. Maybe that'll be different in a few years. But if I go and I listen to a speech or I do a training and I'm able to, and I can do this pretty well, I'm able to listen to a transcript being read and say, ChatGPT, 100% ChatGPT, right? If I can do that, that's now ruined my learning experience. I'm not nearly as invested as I would be as if I knew it was a human who actually wrote it.
No, absolutely. And I think, we all have to go through these. And I think it is that sort of personal journey, in a sense, that I think probably many of us did when social media was coming through, sort of a few decades ago. And it is interesting to see, and it will be interesting to see, where, not where we end up, because it's an ongoing journey, but what that journey starts to look like, and I think what's fascinating and maybe slightly worrying is just the speed at which it's all happening, and so we can see the potential, but then it's about slightly looking back and saying, what are the ethics of this? How do we actually genuinely apply this? What are those, the literacy skills that we need in order to actually make this work for each one of us?
Yeah. And I think that's going to be one of the really interesting dynamics. And I mean interesting in a good way, bad way, and everything in between. The dynamic between technology that is developing at a lightning fast speed and institutions that are historically slow moving and have all these hoops to jump through. And I think that's going to be one of the things to really watch, especially in the higher ed space, right? As kind of this extreme example, when you think about slow moving institutions where changes happen over decades and decades or hundreds of years, you think about colleges and higher ed institutions. And my personal belief, and this goes for companies too, the higher ed spaces are just a really extreme form of this kind of company in many ways. But trying to figure out if the infrastructure can be changed to accommodate that kind of technology, trying to come up with, and we're seeing this with Congress too, right? That as soon as you go through and you think about what the regulation should be, you get it through, you get it passed, you get it stamped and approved. Okay, that's great, but that technology has moved on from that thing, right? It's now fundamentally different than it was 3 months ago when we started to work on this, right? If you step away from AI for a week and you come back into it, it's astounding, right? You have to play catch up and use all your newsletters and what other people are doing. And it's just this astounding experience. And then we're going to see companies and colleges as one sector of that might really struggle with accommodating AI and figuring out how not just to use it, but how to work it into its everyday life, right? Really work it into the structure of the company. I think they're going to struggle to do it in general. I think we can. I'm optimistic that we can, but I think it's going to take a ton of work, and there are going to be so many different models to do it. And then we're going to have to create these processes that allow us to adapt more quickly, especially when the technology changes every week, every few days, really.
Absolutely. And I think what's going to be interesting is how we then address sort of issues or challenges around things like ownership, creativity, accountability. You know, when essentially we're taking all this data, all this content, we're getting something else to process it, and then we may or may not come back and cast our eye over it.
Yeah. And tracking what's actually happening. And that's the big part of AI literacy that is so complicated, right? Being able to say what is and what is not okay. So where AI literacy kind of links up with ethics. And we have to be able to revise that, because even now, there are so many lawsuits that are being played out right now in terms of what is okay. Right? Now that we're learning more about, say, what happens when we pop something to ChatGPT and it scrapes the internet and finds these sources, well, what is it doing? And then OpenAI has actually closed the door even more, right? So when they brought out ChatGPT 4, everyone was kind of, I think, blown away by just how more advanced it was, because there's so much more data, and how, we could, they showed us the image of a website and him recreating it, and all that was really, really cool. But the other thing that they changed is they made it really harder to figure out how the black box was working. And that might actually be a model for how a lot of companies move forward. And so when we have that, and then we suddenly start to learn more in the lawsuits, that's going to be one way that the black box starts to be broken apart. We start to learn more about what's actually happening when that happens, and what happens when an AI is being trained on data, and what that means when those people who created that data did not consent to having their data mined or scraped, or whatever language you want to use. That's the big part of AI literacy that's going to be so complicated as these lawsuits work themselves out and people win or lose or whatever. And then we have to fundamentally change potentially how we understand what AI is doing and whether it's okay or not.
And I think what you'll see, and what you're already seeing, is sort of big corporates, in a sense, creating their own AI engines and AI landscape. So you're going to have all these things sitting alongside each other, which in a sense are closed. They're closed systems. So that may be one way, but even so, if you trace the source right back, what does that start to look like?
It's a matter of what they build it on.
Yeah.
And that's going to be such an interesting one, especially for colleges. And I'm going to use that just to, as an example, because it's kind of fresh in my mind. It's the space in which I work. But I personally think that over the next couple of years, AI operators are going to be a huge, huge thing in basically every space, right? This job that is going to be trying to figure out how their AI tools link and how they can use them for an overarching strategy. And then one part of that is going to be, and this is where I think maybe it's not an AI operations person, but it might be a team, but trying to figure out if you need to build something from the ground up. And, everything has an origin, right? Everything has that initial data source. And so we need to really look at that root cause. Like, is it actually created from the ground up. Sorry, because even even now you can go and look at these supposedly created from the ground up AI systems, and once you poke around a little bit, you say, oh, but it was built with an open AI API. It's like, then it's not from the ground up, right? Because you have, even regardless of the safeguards that you put in place, if it's based on that initial data, then it doesn't have a status. And then you have the companies, which and I think is going to continue to happen, who, as you mentioned, are really using employee generated data, right, from beginning to end. And then it's just a matter of what companies need to do, what colleges need to do to actually make that happen if they decide that that's what needs to happen. And that is super, super complicated. And it is even more complicated in the education space, right? And for me, I actually think the colleges have the easier job. A K-12 institution, that is going to be very difficult, right? Figuring out how to have an AI that you can actually trust. I mean, even I think about 24 hours ago, there was a data breach with OpenAI, right, where all of this information was suddenly leaked, and there have been all these other examples about what's happening with our information, whether it's being hacked or it's leaking into other people's links. Apparently, that happens too. What do you do when the people who are using your software are in 7th grade, right? Like, what do you do with that? And so that's going to be like the really, really, really complicated version of that question.
Yeah, no, and you know, with that, I think we are at a really exciting point, you know, that perhaps if we think about it from your student's perspective, they've not experienced before, in a sense, you know, hence their concern or their anxiety towards it, you know, and what does that future look like for them? But I think, you know, you in trying to have that discussion with them in the first place, and not sort of be a heavy hand in which direction they go in, but to try and get them just to think about it, is in a sense what I think we should all be doing. Is it's thinking about it, exploring it, taking an active position rather than just looking the other way, you know,
and being able to revise that position as more and more things come out. And I try to emphasize that more, that we all get caught up in things like OpenAI and everything else, and then you start to, you know, do a more nuanced dive into everything. You start to really look at copilots, right, and trying to figure out how that's going. I think that's going to be the next big thing as those become widely available, you know, on Microsoft devices and everything else. Once we have copilots that we're so used to seeing pop up, right? Some of us have already rigged our computers to do this, right? But now it's going to be the standard. And then once that happened, being able to revise our position. And I think that we have to be very, very open. I have learned to trust people who are uncertain. Whenever someone says they know exactly what's going on, they know what the next 10 years are going to look like, I immediately start to write them off, right? And I just think, no, you do not. Please stop saying that. You're trying to sell me something, right? All of those sort of emotions and thoughts pop into my head. But being able to talk, revise our positions, and be open with how we're revising them. I think that the rise of AI and ChatGPT was interesting for many reasons, but one, because it really made the standard for saying you are an expert in it very, very low. People who had been experimenting with ChatGPT for a couple months, then suddenly in January they're saying, I'm an AI expert. I am the #1 AI expert in the entire world, right? And they could say that because it's like this weird loophole, even if it's fundamentally not true. And so I think that happened. And people realize that, oh, to really get ahead, I need to just, you know, really have a very firm position and not be willing to change it. And that's exactly what I think we don't need to do. I think that it's about open conversation and being able to say, you know, I was wrong, I was mistaken, because I think we need to find that balance. We need to be willing to hazard an opinion, knowing that we may be wrong. And this is one of the things I try to do on social media. I try to be very honest with it too, saying that this is what I think is going to happen. So like I think literally today I wrote about AI colleges and what those are going to be, because I think that's going to be another big step for the higher ed space, and trying to make it clear that like I don't know, I think this is going to happen, right? But I think it's our ethical obligation to try to find that balance. We want to have that position, and then we can revise it later, and I'm hoping people understand if people end up being wrong.
And I think that's half of the challenge at the moment, or half of what we should all be doing, is actually just posing those questions, right? And understanding that there, at this stage, there is no right or wrong, but we should be exploring it, to sort of understand and think through what those possibilities might be. And as you said, and be open if they don't happen, or if they happen in a different way, because actually, if we're looking for transparency and, in a sense, honesty out of AI itself, we've got to be those things as well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and be able to, well, be human, be able to actually interact with each other that way. And I think that many of us have fallen into these robotic conversations when one person says AI is going to destroy all jobs, the next person says no, AI is not going to take your job, a person who uses AI will, which I personally do not like. I think it's just a clever turn of phrase. But then we get to a point where those become the positions, everyone takes their side, and then we all go home, right? Nothing actually happened out of the conversation, and trying to figure out, what the assumptions are in all of those positions and how we can start to move forward. Yeah, I think that has to start with trust. It has to start with openness. And it has to start with embracing vulnerability. Even in these spaces where we're not supposed to be vulnerable, we want to be experts, we want to be seen as smart, we want to be seen as whatever, right? Whatever we want to be seen as. And I think that a lot of what needs to happen is we need to find a way to restrain those impulses and to focus on just the ideas, and kind of understanding them a little bit more, because the stakes are huge here, right? For us to be able to actually figure this stuff out. They're huge for college students. They're huge for students in general. They're huge for the workforce. They're huge just with how we interact with each other. So yeah, step number one is we have to be human in our interactions. And sometimes I think we don't do that.
No, I agree. And I think on that note, I'm going to bring this to a close, because I'm aware I try to make them all around 30 minutes. It does feel like this is a conversation that we're only halfway through, which is a great thing. This is also, I think, the first interview I've done where I've not talked about microlearning at all. So that is so that's something to celebrate. So that may be something for next time. But with that, Jason, thank you so much for sharing this moment. It's been great to have a conversation with you about AI, and just sort of just allowed it to go wherever it went. So thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome, and thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.